Today I'm going to be putting on a SLEE battery tray onto a 2000 Landcruiser. And I've got my 99 LX right behind me that I'm going to be using just to demonstrate a couple other things. We'll be running through the instruction sheet from SLEE, and I'll also be putting on a twin compressor from ARB. Before I get started with anything else, I'm just going over all the parts, making sure everything is here. Per the list, looks like the important parts are to make sure that all of the big pieces of metal, as well as the hooks and hardware, are here, and both instruction sheets. This is just an additional top sheet with instructions on how to mount the power steering reservoir with the new bracket. I've gone ahead and I've disconnected the negative terminal on the battery, and that's the starter battery on the truck, just to make sure that if I'm unplugging anything, it's not going to ruin a circuit or something terrible. And I've also removed the air box, air hose actually, and next I'm going to start working on removing the air box and the power steering reservoir from the engine bay. It's worth noting that I'm going to literally just be going through the instructions sheet on the SLEE. These are on the SLEE website, but they also come with the kit. If you have these, you can run through them yourself, but the video is just to help those of us who might need a visual aid. So that's what I'll be doing. That's the process I'm following. The first step in the instructions sheet pertains to the daylight running lights resistor, which was installed on all LX470s due to a recall because the daytime running lights were actually too bright. But on the Landcruiser, it's obviously not here. I don't know if Toyota installed those on some Landcruisers, but it's not here on this one. And since some of you might be a little bit curious, this is what the daytime running light resistor actually looks like installed in an LX. And again, I don't know if these were also installed in other Landcruisers. It might have been a recall for later years, but in the 2000 it's not there. I should note that if you are removing the resistor, then there are just two small 10mm bolts right there and there that you have to pop out, and there's a connector here which should be removed, so just be careful when removing that. And the connector, you're removing that just so that you can set this to the side while you install the bracket, the battery tray. But once the tray is set in place, there's actually some holes and some hardware to mount this to the tray so that you can relocate it, just like the power steering reservoir and everything else over here. Next, the instructions say to inspect just visually the power steering reservoir hoses, and it looks to me like this larger one might be in need of replacement, so I might hit up the owner and see what he wants to do about it eventually. But for now, since this is all he wants me to do, I'm just going to proceed with the removal. So all you need to do is pop this small bracket out with a flathead screwdriver or something similar until it comes out. The next step in the instructions is to remove this airbox, which I've actually gone ahead and done. But for those of you who need some instructions on how to do that, I'll show you on my rig over here. There's the MAF sensor wire, and this connector is pretty brittle, so you just got to be careful with that when removing it. There are four just little hooks that hold the airbox tight. There's a screw right there around that clamp. Hose here, part of the PCV kit. Two vacuum lines there, another vacuum line here, 10mm here, 10mm on the back right there. And once those are removed, you can just pop the whole thing up and off. Next is to remove the airbox right here, which I'll be doing with two 6-inch extensions, 3/8 drive, and a 12 millimeter socket to get those 3 bolts out. It's a good idea to just spray all these bolts with some penetrant, because on this truck in particular, it's very rusty, and I would hate to break those, so do what you can to minimize that risk. Well, if you are curious why I was hitting all that with some penetrant, that right there is why. Because these bolts are very crusty. I'm gonna do my best to keep these nice and cleaned up, but I might have to replace them anyway. Yikes. I'm gonna remove the airbox, which is pretty simple. You just rock it back and forth, and just want to be careful of the MAF wire on this side as you pull it out, and you're good to go. So again, to show you that, all I did was twist the box back and forth, and on the far side of the box right here, there was a plastic clip holding the MAF wire to the airbox, so I just had to pull that out. I pulled it down, which exposed this side of the clip, then stuck a screwdriver up and was able to pry it out. So once the airbox is out, you might want to just clean that up a little bit, do what you can to make it look a little prettier, and you'll definitely want to clean out the air channel just a little bit. And then next you'll go ahead and work your way over to the power steering reservoir bracket that comes installed from the factory, and those are just 3 12 millimeters. And next we'll move on to that ABS clip. Lovely look at my rechargeable battery. And now that the power steering reservoir bracket is out of the way, we can get to the ABS harness right here. And this is actually, I believe that's an AHC connector. And I'm removing that by just prying down on both plastic bits on each side and pushing it out. Just like any old Toyota piece of plastic. Well, you get the idea. Yeah, so this is a two-hand operation, unless you're really skilled. But I just got a small set of pliers and put them on both sides, clamped down, and pushed in, and it popped right out. So the next step in the SLEE instructions is to actually remove this connector and bend this bracket to where it's parallel instead of perpendicular to this other part, which is the 10 millimeter bolt holding it in place. The part that we're actually removing is from within the wheel well, so you'll poke that out from the bottom, which is why, and that's this wire harness holder. And there it is. So we'll do that real quick. So first step is to actually go ahead and bend this whole bracket down, which I'm just doing with some standard pliers, trying to bend at the lowest point on the bracket. And once that's all the way perpendicular to parallel to the mounting bracket, I'll go ahead and locate inside the wheel well and pop that out. Find the bracket in the top of the engine bay, then go down and locate it maybe with your hand or something. You'll see where it is. Just use some pliers or something and pop upwards, and you'll feel it just go right up. While digging through the instructions, I actually found a discrepancy between the actual hardware that they send and the old hardware, which From what I can tell, it actually looks like the design has changed. It used to be powder coated black, but now it says that it's stainless steel, which reflects what I have in my hands. But as you can see, the mount for the power steering reservoir changed over time. So this next step says to go ahead and install this piece onto the battery tray. So I'll be doing that next, but just so you're aware, it is a little bit different. And they did include an additional sheet of paper that details how to install the reservoir into the new style piece. So that's helpful at least. But I don't think that they really mention that happened. So anyway, that's just a tip that I learned. When mounting the new reservoir holder, it says to use 2 M6 by 16 bolts, and just looking at all the hardware that comes with it, you can pretty easily match what goes with which. These 2 bolts, I mean, they're all different sizes, so it's kind of obvious. There are only 3 lock washers, or lock nuts, and only 3 of these style bolt, so that's pretty straightforward. These are the only bolts and nuts that fit together of this size, and there are 2 extra nuts that fit onto the battery holders. So there you go. But you're going to be wanting to use 2 of these, which will fit perfectly inside, to mount that onto the tray once you position it in the engine bay. If you're stupid like me, then you'll have a hard time figuring out how this thing is supposed to fit in here. But essentially you want the SLEE logo to be facing towards the front of the engine bay, so you can read it when you look into the engine bay from the front. These 2 holes are where you're going to mount the power steering reservoir mount. And the next step, which I'll cover in just a second, requires actually poking out the liner, which is basically just some insulation. So you'll have to poke that out at those 2 holes in order to fit the hardware in, and that's if you don't have an AHC system. If you have an AHC pump that's been removed, chances are that those holes are already unblocked, so you can just go ahead and thread the hardware straight through them. Alright, so when you're actually installing the hardware on the back, it says not to tighten it down, but just to go ahead and get it all in place. And you'll be using 2 of the 3/4 inch long bolts that are 5/16 thread, and this is all grade 8 hardware, and you'll use four of these washers, 1 on each side, so 1 on the top of the engine bay and 1 underneath the wheel well, and that's with the nylock nuts. So those are the lock nuts with the little rubber grommet inside of them. So for these, I'm just taking a flathead screwdriver and pushing as much of that stuff out as I can in order to get those holes freed up for the bolts to go through. Alright, so I've actually run into a problem with the kit from SLEE, and that's that this massive wire harness here, which is mostly unused connectors for the AHC system, is in the way, which means that I'll have to figure out a way to route just the ABS connector over to the other side right here. So that's an interesting choice there. I guess that this wasn't really designed to work that well with AHC systems anyway, but clearly this is a little bit of an oversight. But if you have this problem, then I'll come up with a solution and we'll see what happens. Alright, so I've gone ahead and taken a lot of the tape off, and it looks like these are very much separate, and they may have never intended to be routed together like that, which is very interesting. So perhaps I should not be mad at SLEE, but instead Toyota for installing a bunch of AHC bullcrap in a Landcruiser. So pretty interesting that all this is in there for a non-AHC truck, but Alright, back to it. Okay, so I went ahead and installed those two bolts, as you can see, and I'm gonna, get all that mess out of the way. And those bolts are running down into the wheel well. Now, I found it was easiest to use one arm over the top of the fender and hold the bolt in place while I use my other hand to just put the nut on. And those are lock nuts, so the instructions say to just put them on there loosely, and then we'll tighten them up when all of that is set in place. For the next section, we're installing this bolt, which goes right through that hole. But as you can see, if you're doing this at home, then you'll notice that there's a pretty significant gap between where this bolt threads in and the actual tray, which is why this spacer is included. So it'll go spacer between these two parts, and the bolt will just thread in there. And I'm just going to put that in loosely. And there it is. So now those three bolts are installed and the tray's in place at least. And I found that these are a 13mm socket will fit over those bolt heads. Alright, so the next part is to put this leg in place, and there's only one that fits. They're not the same, so just grab the two legs and put whichever one fits in place. And grab the other M8 bolt, which is just the same as the one we installed just a second ago over there, but it's shorter. And that threads right into this hole, which is where the old power steering reservoir bracket was. So I'm going to go ahead and put this reservoir in the new position there. And for the hardware that attaches right here, I'm going to use the ARB hardware to mount the twin compressor, which will secure all of that together rather than using the hardware that came with the kit, or with the SLEE kit to be precise. Okay, I've got the reservoir in place, and the bolts that hold that bracket onto the SLEE tray are 10mm. So I just tighten those up real quick. And now, with the new design, all you need to do is get a screwdriver in there between those two parts, just like that, and pry towards the reservoir, and that'll fix the tab onto it so that the reservoir stays in place. For the next leg, you'll actually have to drill through the wheel well here, and in order to do that, I've gone ahead and attached this leg to the SLEE tray, and I'm marked with a Sharpie where I'm going to be drilling, and that's to fit some of that extra hardware, and that's one of those gold ones, just like this. So once that's in place, I'm going to go ahead and remove the leg, drill through there, and attach the hardware. And I am actually going to remove this as well, since I'm installing the ARB compressor behind it, so I can just use the ARB hardware to attach the compressor to the tray and the legs. The drill bit that I'm going to be using is a 3/8, and that fits this hole pretty perfectly. Get yourself a good pair of these, because safety. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to go ahead and install the extra hardware there, and that's just for the extra leg here. And I'm actually not putting the compressor on just yet because it still has to get connected to the battery and all that nonsense, so I'll get all that done at some point, I guess, but that's for another video. Alright, and there it is. So this is the hole that you've drilled through the fender, and as long as the bracket fits well enough to where you can still get one bolt through, then it's good enough, in my opinion. The next step is to go ahead and tighten down all the hardware and get this set in position. So we'll get right to it. Oh, and for the bolt there, it's another one of those that goes through the wheel well. So there are all three of them, right here, here, and here. So go ahead and tighten them up. After you've tightened all the hardware, it says to trim the power steering reservoir, which as I experienced it was really only necessary for the old style mount. So with the new one you don't need to trim it. But if you haven't already done so, you can go ahead and install the power steering reservoir onto the bracket. And it says here that it might be necessary to release some of the tension on the hose clamps. And from there it moves on to the resistor and relocating that onto the SLEE tray, which again, if you don't have the resistor on your truck, then this doesn't apply to you. But if you did have that resistor, the kit supplies you with a self-drilling screw that can be used right here to install the resistor right over there, just so that it's, instead of just wobbling around, you can have it hard mounted, because the compressor is going to sit right here and the battery right behind it. So the resistor will just chill right there and the airbox will go in. The self-drilling screw that I mentioned, or just the self-tapping screw, whatever, is in the event that there's no space on the actual SLEE mount, you can just mount it right onto the side of the fender, which would obviously not be the best. I'd prefer to mount it on the bracket, but that is an option for those of you who will have that resistor. So next is just to install the battery, which I do not yet have for this customer. He just wanted me to go ahead and install the mount, and then he'll get the battery and do that. But you'll use these two J bolts, as well as this hardware, and the SLEE battery, what do you call this? The hold down bracket. And you'll just want to pay attention to how you mount all that stuff, because there is, of course, the wire harness coming right off of the back right there. So you'll just want to be mindful of that, and depending on what kind of battery you buy, you might have to relocate the harness just a little bit, which you can pretty easily do if you just loosen that bracket and move it around a little bit. But that's pretty much it in terms of the hardest parts, the hardware side. So from there, you'll just install the battery, and the J hooks hook right into those 2 points there and there, just like your regular battery mount has a J hook. All right, so I've got this airbox put back into position, and I realized that I'm actually missing one of the rubber grommets, one of those things. So I'm gonna make my own out of some leftover power steering hose that I have from another job, and just it's the right diameter that it'll work well enough So I'm going to cut 2 pieces of it and put one on each side, and that way it's just, you know, it's got a shock mount of some kind, even if it isn't OEM, just to prevent this from breaking loose or rattling. Okay, so for one more look, basically I've just got a piece of hose on the top and bottom of that mount point, and I'm gonna screw that bolt back in, and that should do it. So now the airbox is reinstalled, so I can go ahead and reconnect this harness right here for the MAF, and bingo, so that's ready to go. And now I'll go ahead and get the second part of the airbox, that hose, back in place. And that's about it. So the tray is in place, the airbox is back and all bolted up, albeit a little bit, you know, fun. The hose is in the spot. The power steering reservoir is solid and in its location, and I'll see about that leaking hose. We'll see what he wants to do. Again, I would recommend replacing those, especially since they've been molded over 22 years to sit in one position, and now they've been moved. So whether you replace them with OEM or go off aftermarket, that's up to you, but you know, anything will be better than the way it is. And I went ahead and just taped all these wire harnesses out of the way. I doubt that he's ever going to use those for anything, you know, but at least this way he has them there, and then tucked them up and underneath the battery tray. And if those rattle, then, you know, we'll see about just cutting them off or whatever he wants to do. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Be sure to leave a comment down below to recommend my next video. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear it. I'll be installing an ARB dual compressor in this guy, and then I've also got a lot of work on my truck that I could film. If that's something that's interesting to you, then feel free to subscribe and follow along, and we'll see where it goes. But as of right now, I'm just glad that you're here, and thanks for following this far. Thanks. Adios.